Imperialism, while the expansion in the Pacific to the Alaska and Samoa and Hawaii, while important to the growth of imperialism, it would be in America's very backyard that the explosion into imperialism would take place. And it would ironically be American outrage at another empire's imperialism that would lead to the greatest expansion of American territory, American commerce, and America's involvement in the world. The chief motive was reaction to and a sense of compassion for the Cuban people. Cuba, which had belonged to Spain since 1492, part of their imperial acquisitions from Columbus's first voyage, had periodically, over the ensuing 400 years, Cuba had periodically risen to revolution many, many times. In fact, it was almost cyclical. Every 10 to 15 years, there was going to be a revolution in Cuba. But in the late Gilded Age, and in the period we've been discussing, when the next rise to revolution occurred in Cuba, it occurred at a precise time in which America was ready to respond, in which America was ready to get involved. It fit into the economic, the philosophical, and the militaristic worldview that was dominant in the late 19th century in the United States. And part of that revolution and part of the uprising was caused by the United States. Originally, Cuba had been allowed to import its sugar into the United States without a tariff placed upon it. But the Wilson-Gorman tariff of 1894 had removed sugar off of the free list and had placed almost a ruinous tariff on Cuban sugar. It competed with American-grown sugar, and thus it created an economic depression in Cuba that set off a wave of revolutions. So economically, Cuba was ripe for revolution, and economically, the United States was ready to invest. And one of the ways to bring Cuban sugar back onto the free list, at least seen by the sugar producers and Cuban revolutionaries, is if Cuba declared its independence and entered into a reciprocal trade agreement with the United States, or, as many American sugar producers sought, Cuba was attached to the United States as a territory, then it would receive all of the benefits of favorable trade with American sugar producers. And so the Wilson-Gorman tariff of 1894 is one of the key causes of that revolution in Cuba. To put down that revolution, the Spanish had dispatched Governor General Valeriano Weyler, lovingly known in the American press as the Beast. In fact, increasingly the Spanish came to be tied to or associated with brutal repression. And a lot of that comes from General Valeriano Weyler. You see, Weyler had a problem in Cuba, like the United States has discovered in Afghanistan, in Iraq, we had previously discovered in Vietnam, in Korea. It's hard to tell friend from foe in an indigenous population. And the Spanish were having real problems identifying who were their supporters and who were their enemies. You know, the smiling kid on the street looks like a friend until you walk past him and suddenly stabs you in the back. He's not a friend. And so Governor General Weyler had come up with a new plan. It was called Reconcentrados. The idea of bringing the population of Cuba into specific camps around the island. And if you were not in those camps, you were an enemy. If you were in those camps, you were a friend. And in fact, that policy might have worked if it had been accomplished by an industrialized nation with the resources of, say, Great Britain or Germany or even the United States. But Spain was long past its economic heyday. It simply didn't have the infrastructure to provide all of the things needed by an isolated population in these cities. They had to provide food, medicine, healthcare, clothing, everything that the populace needed to keep them in these camps. And Spain simply didn't have the resources and didn't have the ability to supply it. And so here is how Spain is treating its friends. The people who support the regime are the ones in the camps, and they began dying off by the hundreds and the thousands. Some historians have estimated, because there are no clear-cut figures, but that the Cuban people were dying off at thousands per week. Some have even estimated 1,000 people per day died in the camps over the years of 1895, 96, and 97. Now, I think that figure's a little high, but nonetheless, the death rate was horrific, and it was occurring at a time that American media was involved in what was known as the yellow press. Now, you have to be careful because on one hand, as historians, we put arbitrary divisions in history. On one hand, we turn around and say the press of the 1890s was the yellow press, that this ongoing feud between Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst for circulation was extravagant, it was propagandistic, it was designed to be attract readers and attract followers to make the almighty buck. At the same time, in the next section, we're going to look at progressivism, which is happening in the 1890s and which is centered in the press. And we turn around and say, well, the press, especially these enlightened writers, were called muckrakers. And they advocated sound policy and they used the media to further their agenda. Well, you can't have it both ways. You can't have the virtuous muckrakers and the horrible yellow press. I'm saying the truth is probably somewhere between the two. But in the rise to the Spanish-American War, the two newspaper titans of America, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, are locked in a struggle for circulation. We call it yellow press because of the cartoon in the middle. One of the first cartoons in America, it was called The Yellow Kid. And some have argued that the yellow kid, as you read the newspaper print of the day, the yellow dye came off on your fingers, and hence the emphasis on the yellow kid. But it was a popular cartoon of the day and came to represent the media of the day and its feeding frenzy to find all of the extravagant, the salacious tidbits that they could print. And Spain in Cuba provided that fodder, provided those stories that could be aggrandized into the media, could be expanded to the populace. Stories of the rape and pillage of the virtuous and innocent Cuban people. And I use that tongue-in-cheek. There were atrocities on both sides. But the virtuous Cuban people being oppressed by the beast of Spain. In fact, there was a story that was carried in the Hearst newspapers of a woman that was removed from a Cuban train by Spanish authorities. She was suspected of being a spy, and that she had documents hidden on her person. And as it was portrayed in the Hearst media, she was strip searched by Spanish officials, and this virtuous woman, her nudity exposed to these leering Spanish officials. Well, she wasn't an innocent woman. She was, in fact, a spy. But the Spanish officials, while searching her, did not do it in person. They had their wives do the searching. But that wasn't told. See, there was a kernel of truth, but not the full story was portrayed. Only the salacious was expanded into a story for the populace. The tales of death and suffering in the camps, while in many instances true, were exaggerated to monumental proportions, and the American people ate it up. Let me ask you a question today. Why do Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, all of the news networks, ABC News, CBS News, NBC News, why do they exist? To provide you information? No. They exist to make money off of advertising. And so if stories can be presented that make you want to watch, make you want to tune in because of the good-looking weatherman or woman, the lure of the sports highlights, whatever it is that makes you tune in, they draw you in, and then they use that viewership to get advertisers to pay more because their viewership has expanded. Same thing with the yellow press. They use and begin using in this time period cartoons, sports stories, advertisements, all of these as inducements to then turn around and charge the advertiser more, help wanted ads, all of those things to draw more circulation in. They're not intended as a news source, and while they do provide the news, and while there is some element of maybe neutrality to it, that's not their intent. Their intent is to make money. And the Spanish-American War did just that. In fact, one of my favorite stories, William Randolph Hearst hired one of the most famous American artists of the day, Frederick Remington. Being a graduate of TCU, spending time at the Amon Carter Museum in Fort Worth, which has the largest collection of Remington statues and paintings. Absolutely incredible artwork. William Randolph Hearst hired Remington to go to Cuba and draw pictures of the atrocities and the war. And when Remington got to Cuba, he telegrammed back to Hearst and said, "I'm in Cuba and there is no war." And Hearst supposedly telegraphed back and said, "You just draw the pictures, I'll provide the war." And so the Spanish-American War occurs at this moment in time. The oppression of Cuba occurs at a moment in time in which the Cuban people are ripe, the American people are ripe. They're fed the constant news of Spanish barbarism, and they come to sympathize with the Spanish people, the Cuban people, and they demand action. In fact, President Grover Cleveland would be president when the Cuban Revolution broke out, and Cleveland would offer the offices of the United States to mediate the dispute, to bring about resolution, preferably to the benefit of the Cuban people. Cleveland was an anti-imperialist. He had no desire for American expansion into Cuba, but Spain refused. Spain refused. And so in the election of 1896, public pressure mounted for whoever was elected in 1896 to take action, whether it be William Jennings Bryan or William McKinley. And with McKinley's victory, he promised the American people he would bring an end to the suffering of the Cuban people. And so with his election in November of 1896, taking office in March of 1897, he begins putting pressure on the Spanish government to bring about resolution to the humanitarian crisis. Spain responds by recalling General Weyler, of course appointing a new governor general to oversee. McKinley has often been attacked that he was a warmonger that set out to immediately get the United States into a war. But in fact, the historical record really doesn't support that. He enters office of March of 1897, and he spends almost a year trying to normalize relations. In fact, he's so successful, in November of 1897, Spain offers to Cuba autonomy within the Spanish Empire. That does not mean independence. That means autonomy. That means they can govern themselves within the Spanish Empire, but they still belong to Spain. And in return, the rebels have to cease fighting and bring an end to the revolution. Both sides, rebels and loyalists, refused. But McKinley, because of the Spanish effort, and Spain seems to be making strides toward ending the conflict, McKinley decides to normalize relations with Cuba and with Spain. For the past 100 years, the United States Navy, every year, as it does, by the way, around the world, even today, but more importantly back then, U.S. warships paid courtesy calls to different foreign ports, especially capital ports, to show the flag, to reconcile if there are any outstanding differences, but really just an international exchange. And other nations do this with the United States too. And for the past 100 years, there had been a U.S. naval courtesy call paid to the port of Havana, Cuba. Because of the Cuban Revolution, Grover Cleveland had suspended those courtesy calls, not wanting to antagonize further actions against American property or American interest, and he certainly didn't want to see the United States drug into the conflict. McKinley, as a sign to Spain and the American public that Spain was cooperating and the United States wanted to help, decides to resume those courtesy calls. And so, January 25th, 1898, with the support of the U.S. Ambassador to Spain, Stuart Woodford, and the U.S. Consul to Spanish Cuba, Fitzhugh Lee. For those of you students of the Civil War, you'll recognize that he was a Confederate general during the Civil War. Fitzhugh Lee had been appointed by Grover Cleveland. McKinley coming into office, not believing that the ambassadorship to Cuba, the consulship, needed to be shaken up, keeps Lee in office because he knows the conditions in Cuba and would be the best person to bring about resolution to those problems. And so January 25th, 1898, the United States pays their first courtesy call to Cuba in well over 4 years. So January 25th, 1898, the USS Maine, often referred to as a battleship, but naval historians say that it's not really a battleship, it's an armored cruiser. The United States struggled, and Theodore Roosevelt writes about this in his autobiography. The American people had a real problem with building battleships because battleships sound offensive. It sounds like the United States is going out to wage war, and we can't have that. So Roosevelt says we had to settle on lesser terms, which also meant lesser ships, and one of those is an armored cruiser. So the USS Maine is an armored cruiser, but for the day it was state-of-the-art, and you can see it on the left sailing into Havana Harbor on January 25th, 1898, to make that first courtesy call. Under the command of Captain Charles Sigsbee, the ship anchors in Havana Harbor. The crew enjoys shore leave. The officers are invited to participate in various activities. Consul Lee and Captain Sigsbee were both invited to attend a bullfight. Neither one particularly enjoyed the sport, but they went along to humor the Spanish officials. And all seemed to be going well in the ensuing 2 weeks that followed the arrival of the Maine. But then on February the 9th, 1898, William Randolph Hearst published a letter that had come into his possession. Now, the origins of this letter are suspect. The fact that it's authentic isn't suspect, but how Hearst got it is. It was the Delome letter. It was written by the Spanish ambassador to the United States, and he had written it to the Governor General of Cuba. The Governor General of Cuba had inquired of Delome, what is William McKinley like? What is this man? Can you give me a read on him? And Ambassador Delome should have not responded, or if he did respond, he should have put it in a diplomatic pouch. But either way, the letter was stolen out of the Havana mail and sent to William Randolph Hearst. Hearst published it, and in that letter, Ambassador Delome calls President McKinley, and I quote, "weak and a bidder for the admiration of the crowd." Now, weak and a bidder for the admiration of the crowd, we call that a politician in the United States, but that was his view, that McKinley was just being a politician, that he was a weak leader, he was a bidder for the admiration of the crowd, and that he was a would-be politician who tries to leave a door open behind himself while staying on good terms with his party. In other words, he's going to take action, but he's always going to have a retreat open to him. So before you get all crazy and excited about, what McKinley decides, understand he's a politician. Now, there's not really anything that scandalous. In fact, compare that with what Theodore Roosevelt, who was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, what Theodore Roosevelt had said about William McKinley. He said that William McKinley was white-livered, that he had no more backbone than that of a chocolate eclair. Far worse than what Delome said. But there's a difference. In fact, look at any president in American history, current president, previous president. Americans can talk bad about their president. We elected them. We can talk bad about them. But don't let somebody else, a foreign country, talk bad about our presidents. And so the American reaction was incredibly hostile to Spain for talking bad about McKinley. In fact, they cemented more public support from McKinley than McKinley's policies had. Him being insulted by the Spanish ambassador rallied the public around the president. And at this key moment in American-Spanish relations, Delome is forced to resign. So the Spanish ambassador to the United States is gone. Is gone at this key moment. A week later, on the night of February 15th, 1898, an absolutely spectacular evening as the Journal of Clara Barton, the American founder of the American nursing, she was in Havana treating the victims of the reconcentration camps. She was in Havana Harbor, had just walked outside. Captain Sigsbee and Consul Lee were enjoying drinks on the harbor. A lot of the officers were away from the ship. And on the night of February 15th, the USS Maine exploded. There was an incredible explosion that shook the harbor. They look out across the harbor and you see the Maine with this cloud of steam, smoke, water, and debris hanging in the air. And then, of course, all across the harbor, that debris began to come down and fall on the buildings and the other ships. All of the foreign warships that were anchored in Havana Harbor, because the Maine was by no means the only one, began putting boats rescue boats into the water and sending them to search for survivors. The USS Maine sank to the bottom of Havana Harbor. You see it there on the right. The harbor's not that deep, so it sank to the just a little bit above the deck, but you could still walk on the deck. The USS Maine lost 260 officers and men. Well over 100 others were were uninjured or were injured but not killed in the explosion. But the American press immediately reacted with the vim and vigor that we've come to love from the American media. The New York Journal with absolutely no investigation, the New York World being the same, the New York Journal being Pulitzer's newspaper, the New York World being Hearst's newspaper, all reached the conclusion that the Spanish had blown up the Maine with an underwater mine. And you even have a high-tech for the day, a high-tech illustration showing how the mine could have been placed under the Maine so that it not only broke the spine of the Maine, causing it to sink, which, as you notice, that's a pretty deep bay compared to what you see from the Maine still being superstructure still showing above the water. Theodore Roosevelt called the explosion of the Maine, and I quote, "an act of dirty treachery on the part of the Spanish." You can see the lapel pins that were published in the upper right. That lapel pin opens up. "To hell with Spain, remember the Maine." Buttons were published. People went to work wearing black armbands in mourning for the dead of the USS Maine. And the yellow press had a field day. No need for evidence. Remember the Maine became the battle cry. And yet, William McKinley did not rush to war. There would be a series of investigations. In fact, over the last 100+ years, there have been many investigations. The most immediate investigations in 1898, the Spanish investigation determined that it was all of these are American. The Spanish, of course, investigating the accident, reached the conclusion that it was an internal explosion. Then in 1898, the Sampson Board, investigating, said it was an external explosion. And then you see on the various times in which the evidence has been re-examined, and they've gone back and forth between external and internal, whether it was an underwater mine or an internal. And here's how the internal argument goes. The ammunition locker on this particular vessel was located near the coal lockers and the wheat lockers, both of which, wheat and coal, have something in common. They have very explosive dust. So as the coal lockers and the wheat lockers were filled up, the heat began to rise, and the argument is that, and it was specifically made by the Rickover investigation in 1974, that it was an internal explosion, that the coal locker exploded, setting off the ammunition locker, and thus it was a fault of the design, not of the Spanish. The problem with that being, just minutes before the explosion, there was a seaman who was assigned to check the temperatures of all the lockers. He had done so, and the log shows that all the temperatures were well within acceptable range. The Rickover investigation didn't take that into account. And so you have on 1998 investigation, National Geographic reaches no conclusion, but emphasized that the evidence lent toward an external explosion. And then in 2002, the History Channel said it was an internal explosion. So why the back and forth? Political agendas aside, why the back and forth? Well, there's a couple of possible explanations. Whether it was an internal explosion or an external explosion, if it was external, the plates on the ship buckle inward from the external explosion, then the ammunition locker explodes and explodes out. So you get the back and forth of the metal, which leads to the confusion that it could be external, could be internal. If it was an internal explosion, then you get the outward buckling. But if it was a explosion of one locker and then the next locker, you get some more of that wavy. So it's hard for the investigators to determine, and I would reach the conclusion, we don't know. Either way, at the time and of the place, Americans didn't care. Never mind the fact the last people on the face of the earth that want to blow up an American warship is Spain. It is almost a guarantee of war with the United States, and they do not want war. They cannot afford war. Their Navy, while looking good on paper, they know their Navy is not adequate to fight the new U.S. Navy. In fact, on March the 9th, 1898, the U.S. Congress is going to accomplish something that scares the hell out of Spain. On March 9th, U.S. Congress in special session voted, in one vote, mind you, voted $50 million to upgrade the defenses of the United States. To us today, that's no big deal. $50 million, big deal. Well, back then, $50 million was a lot of money. In fact, it was more than the entire budget of Spain. The United States Congress, in one vote, spent more money than Spain would spend in the entire year. And they knew they were dealing with an economic and military juggernaut. Spain has no delusions about how this war is going to come out. But they feel that they have to fight it anyway for honor's sake. When McKinley was hesitant in declaring war, Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt would be quick to pronounce that, and I quote, "We will have this war for the freedom of Cuba in spite of the timidity of the commercial interest and in spite of the timidity of the president." In fact, as the United States began gearing up for war, the Spanish government declared a unilateral ceasefire in Cuba in early April 1898. And then on April the 10th, 1898, they gave what amounted to a surrender. They said, first off, that the United States could declare a ceasefire between the Cuban rebels and the Spanish troops in Cuba, and that the United States could indicate the nature and the duration of the ceasefire. Second, they said that Cuba would have an autonomous government, reasserting their promise of the past. And then third, that the issue of the USS Maine would be submitted to international arbitration. And if the international arbiters, most likely Germany and Great Britain, or Great Britain and Russia, but whoever those international arbiters might be, whatever their decision, if Spain was found at fault, Spain would pay for the USS Maine and pay for the loss of life and pensions to the widows and orphans of the dead Maine sailors. The message, in fact, arrived too late, and it was too little anyway. The United States simply didn't trust that Spain would live up to any argument or any bargain that it made. Spain had repeatedly, over the last 100 years, to keep the United States on the sidelines, promised to change its relationship in Cuba. And when the United States became interested in something else, the American public having the attention span of an amoeba, when the American public was distracted by something else, Spain went back to their old way of doing things. And so no one really believed that Spain would do all of the things it promised. It would just simply wait until the United States was distracted, and then it would resume. While all this was going on in that early spring of 1898, Secretary of the Navy John Long, who was not the most energetic Secretary of the Navy, he tended to rely on his Assistant Secretary of the Navy to do things. Well, one day, Secretary of the Navy Long decided to take his grandchildren fishing and left Theodore Roosevelt in charge of the Navy Department. Theodore Roosevelt took it upon himself to send a telegram around the world to Captain George Dewey, now Commodore Dewey. He told Commodore Dewey that he was to prepare the U.S. Asiatic fleet for action. Now remember, we're still at peace. Our ships look like the one that you see behind me. In fact, that is the USS Olympia, which will be Dewey's flagship. Painted in its peacetime colors. The hull is painted white, the superstructure cream, or whatever beige color that is. Now, in wartime, the United States always painted their ships gray. So Roosevelt sends a message to Dewey and says, Dewey was anchored in Hong Kong with his fleet. He says, prepare your fleet for action. We don't know what's going to happen with Spain, so be ready. You need to go out and buy more colliers. Those are ships that carry coal to reprovision the fleet's fuel supply. You need to buy more colliers. You need to make sure your ships are stocked up on coal. You need to repaint all your ships to wartime gray in anticipation of war. Be ready that if you hear war has broken out, you do not have to wait for further orders. You may sail and engage the Spanish Pacific Fleet. And so Dewey, and by the way, the telegram, when Long returned to the office and found Roosevelt's telegram, he not only didn't disapprove it or disavow it, he forwarded it on to the president. The president, McKinley, approved it. And so the Asiatic fleet was ready for action. Same too with the Atlantic fleet. So when Spain's message of peace arrives, it arrives too late. The United States is already gearing up for war, and no one believes it's going to happen. No one believes that Spain's going to do what they say anyway. President McKinley addressed Congress and asked for authority to take action with regard to Spain. And on April 20th, 1898, a joint resolution of Congress went beyond endorsing the use of force. It declared that Cuba was independent and demanded a withdrawal of Spanish forces, taking that next step toward war. But attached to that joint resolution authorizing the president to take action, Congress also attached an amendment known as the Teller Amendment. The Teller Amendment said, if the United States has to fight a war with Spain, the United States will not take Cuba as a territory for itself. That the United States has no intention of taking Cuba. So the Teller Amendment attached to that joint resolution of Congress. 2 days later, on April the 22nd, President McKinley announces a blockade of Cuba's northern coast and the port of Santiago, Cuba. This is problematic, and to understand what's about to happen, you need to know that. McKinley has declared a blockade of a friendly nation. A blockade is a wartime action. So in retaliation on April 24th, now before we get that, why did McKinley declare a blockade? Because Spain has a massive Caribbean fleet. We know where that fleet is. It's in the port of Santiago. If war is declared and that fleet is able to get out of Santiago Bay, it could appear anywhere. It could appear at Corpus Christi, Galveston, New Orleans, Baltimore, Washington, New York. If it gets out of Cuba, who knows where that fleet could show up? In fact, every little old lady that lives near the coast in the dead of night sees mysterious lights on the Gulf, and the War Department was besieged by American citizens claiming to have seen the Spanish fleet sailing off the coast of the United States at night. And so McKinley declares that blockade to ensure that the Spanish fleet stays in Cuban waters. But it could be seen as a war act. And so the Spanish government declares war on April 24th, 1898. So you got a problem. The U.S. Congress, now responding to the Spanish, say on April 25th, the U.S. Congress responding to the Spanish declaration of war, the U.S. Congress follows suit and declares war on Spain. But they make their declaration of war retroactive to April 21st, therefore making the blockade a legal act. And so with the declaration of war, now if you just stand back and look at that, Spain declares war, then the United States declares war and says, no, but we declared war before you. And then where do you stop with that? And so with the declaration of war, the United States and Spain, the Kingdom of Spain, are at war. Why did the United States go to war? 4 simple reasons why the United States went to war. Public pressure. Public pressure on elected officials to do something about Cuba. Second, business doesn't want war. Business actually abhors war. They like the profits that war brings, but the lead up to war creates instability. And the fact that you might lose a war creates instability within the markets. And so the business community demanded a quick resolution to the problem. So business side, if we're going to fight this war, let's get it over with. Number 3, a lack of trust in Spain. A lack of trust in Spain and Spain's abilities to carry out its promises. And then number 4, the political risks for President McKinley. You know what happens to presidents who lead a nation in a build-up to war and then don't give the nation the war? They are one-term presidents. Ask John Adams. So William McKinley, the political pressure is too high, and McKinley is unable to lead the nation away from war. And in fact, while McKinley is a Civil War hero, a Civil War veteran, and didn't want war, he wants it to be quick and decisive. And so the Spanish-American War begins, or in the words of Theodore Roosevelt, the splendid little war. And it would begin not in Cuba, but on the other side of the globe, in the Spanish possession of the Philippines. In the Philippines, George Dewey, which I've put his ranks on there because George Dewey is really important in naval history. He starts out, before the Battle of Manila Bay, he is the rank of Commodore in command of the Asiatic Squadron. By May of 1898, after he wins the Battle of Manila Bay, he is promoted to Rear Admiral. And then by special act of Congress in 1899, the next year, George Dewey is made Admiral, full Admiral, on March of 1899. By the order of Congress, there was only one Admiral in the U.S. Navy. In 1903, 4 years down the road, Congress is going to make a special office for George Dewey. He's the only man to have ever held this office. It's called Admiral of the Navy. It would be the equivalent of, if there was such, a 6-star admiral. Admiral of the Navy, 1903, but it was made retroactive to 1899, and he is the only naval officer to ever hold that office. And part of that's political. Dewey's being considered as a presidential candidate, although Dewey will then back out, but he's being considered a presidential candidate. So part of it's political, part of it is deserved. But either way, he's done exactly what Theodore Roosevelt had suggested. And in fact, the naval reforms of the Mahanian era have taken effect. You see Dewey's Asiatic Squadron here with the USS Olympia, which is in the upper right corner. You see it in its grayscale there. And then behind me, you see the painted version. That's the same ship. That's Dewey's flagship in the ensuing battle. And then you see his cruisers and support ships that he's going to lead into Manila Bay. Dewey had to leave Hong Kong. Britain is neutral. Britain declares, you have to take your fleet out of our port. You have 24 hours. Dewey heads toward Manila, catching the Spanish fleet of Admiral Patricio Montojo in Manila Bay. Patricio Montojo has no doubt about how this battle is going to go. In fact, his fleet, while on paper he outguns and outweighs Dewey, his ships are old, they're decrepit, many of them aren't even seaworthy. He anchors them in Manila Bay so that when they sink, they will sink in shallow water and his crews can escape. And on May 1st, 1898, you see Dewey's voyage from China to the Philippines, and then his entrance on the right into Manila Bay. You see his fleet in line ahead, engaging the Spanish fleet anchored. And over the course of the next few hours, as Dewey's fleet takes on the Spanish fleet, the United States is going to destroy the Spanish Pacific Fleet in the Battle of Manila Bay, the Spanish losing 381 men. That figure would have been much higher if Montojo had engaged Dewey in the open sea. Dewey's squadron suffered only 8 wounded. No ships lost, only 8 wounded. Mahan's reforms had proven to be effective, and the United States has demonstrated to the world that we are a world power. Before we leave the Philippines, one last thing. Dewey has defeated the Spanish Navy, but not the Spanish Army. And he doesn't have enough Marines to take Manila. He's got Manila Bay, but not the city of Manila. While he's waiting for Marines to arrive, the German East Asiatic Squadron shows up, waiting to take possession of the Philippines. If the United States leaves to get Marines, the Germans are going to take over. So through the summer of 1898, Dewey had to remain anchored in Manila Bay to prevent the Germans from seizing the Philippines. And then when his relief fleet arrived, the Marines were then able to fight for and take the city of Manila. Of course, taking the entirety of the Philippines then becomes a years-long fight between the United States and the Filipino rebels, not just Spanish troops. But we'll talk about that when we get to the surrender and the armistice in the area. One last thing. The Spanish dispatch a relief fleet to fight Dewey. They leave Spain headed for the Suez Canal, led by the battleship Palaeo and all of the cruisers that you see there. But before they could transit the Suez Canal, the British have to decide whether they can allow belligerents engaged in a war to use the Suez Canal. And by the time that the relief fleet is given permission to transit, the fleet is recalled back to Spain and dispatched to the Gulf of Mexico to relieve the Caribbean squadron of the Spanish Navy. But that's a story for next time.